So welcome to this afternoon's first session. It is delightful to see everyone reappear at exactly the right moment, so thank you. My name is Lisa Cahill. I teach here in the theology department, and it is my privilege to moderate this session and to introduce our speakers. Because of our strict time limit, I'm going to make that very brief. And I'll do that quickly now in the order in which they appear on your program. So the first person is Brian Robinette, who's immediately to my left. He is a professor here in our theology department in systematic theology. He works on doctrines such as resurrection and creation, so the big basics. The second one is Natalia Imperatori Lee, who is an associate professor at Manhattan College, and her expertise is in Latina theology and the church or ecclesiology. Vanessa White is from the Chicago Theological Union. I'm sorry. I knew that. Yeah. I went to the divinity school, and therefore I have a different, So from the Catholic Theological Union, she's a professor of spirituality and ministry and does publishing on liturgy and prayer, and also directs a couple of master's programs. And then Kate Ward, one of our graduates, I'm happy to say, is a assistant professor at Marquette University. Her area is ethics. She does economics, ethics, and virtue ethics, especially wealth and inequality and poverty and their relationship to virtue. So we will begin with the first on the list, and that's Brian. So please come up.
Thank you, Lisa. Good afternoon. On the list, it indicates that I'm going to be talking about the nuns and millennialists. It's actually nuns and millennials, but you could imagine how interesting it might be if I were, in fact, talking about millennialists. Given the controversy around the document, you might think that it might be fitting in some way. The question addressed by my talk this afternoon is, how will Amoris Laetitia assist the church's engagement with nuns? N-O-N-E-S. For those unfamiliar with this term, the nuns refers to those who, when surveyed about their religious affiliation, indicate nothing in particular. We might also use the terms unaffiliated and disaffiliated for our present purposes. As survey data show, a significant trend line appears in the rising number of unaffiliated persons in the 1990s. And in the latter half of the 2000s, we can observe a startling uptick in their share of the U.S. population. To put a round number on it, whereas in 1987, approximately 1 in 14 indicated nothing in particular when asked about their religious preference, today that number is 1 in 5. And inching closer towards 1 in 4. This is an astounding development given the historically high degree of religious affiliation in the United States, and it naturally raises the question as to whether the country is headed towards a post-Christian or post-religious future. But there is considerable ambiguity in the data as well, for it turns out that the spiritual restlessness exhibited by the rise of the nuns does not necessarily indicate an outright rejection of religious faith and its institutions, or that growing secularism, narrowly conceived, is afoot. Secularity is part of the story, but so too are new kinds of spiritual languages, narrative frames, and practices that are being born along the way, both within and beyond traditional religious frames. I shall return to this point in a moment, for my reading of Amoris Laetitia is that Pope Francis is making an appeal to family life that is attuned to the spiritual restlessness of our age. Although a comprehensive summary of the data on religious affiliation is not possible here, a few points might be highlighted. The most startling data point in recent years has come from the 2012 report by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. With an estimated 20% of the American population declaring no affiliation with any religious group at the time of the report, religious observers, media outlets, and social commentators had a statistically round and eye-popping number to digest. The number has only increased, and with an accelerated rate, according to the latest Pew study of 2015. The percentage of Americans who are now religiously unaffiliated is closer to 23% of the population. Christian denominations witnessing the greatest net declines are mainline Protestant and Catholic. What sociologists call religious switching is one significant factor in these trends. Over 1/3 of Americans have switched affiliation from one to another from the tradition in which they were raised. Therefore, every group has experienced net gains and losses, though some disproportionately. For example, whereas nuns have increased the most on account of switching, Catholics have lost the most. For every person who switches to a Catholic affiliation, 6.5 persons become unaffiliated. This net loss to Catholic affiliation is nearly 4 times greater than it is for mainline Protestants. Another significant factor is the generation-based change underway. Whereas 17% of baby boomers are unaffiliated, 23% of Generation Xers, and 35% of millennials identify as nothing in particular. This acceleration has led some to speculate that if current trends continue, the number of unaffiliated persons in the U.S., together with those who identify with non-Christian religious traditions, will outnumber Christians within 30 years. Perhaps the United States is currently in a process of deep secularization, much like that found in Western Europe, where church attendance and religious affiliation has fallen precipitously in recent decades. Yet other observers are more cautious about such predictions. In their monumental study, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, published in 2010, Robert Putnam and David Campbell expressed strong reservations about whether the rise of the nuns implies that the secularization of Western Europe is paradigmatic for the United States. When we inquire further into the survey data to learn more about why the nuns do not affiliate with religious institutions, a more complicated picture emerges. The nuns, they insist, are not uniformly unbelievers, and although less attached to religious institutions, they exhibit curiosity and inventiveness with respect to religious beliefs and practices. This is why Putnam and Campbell have encouraged reference to the sums in the literature, or alternatively, the liminals. These are persons who, in their words, seem to stand at the edge of some religious tradition, unsure whether to identify with that tradition or not. Putnam and Campbell also note another major reason for the increase in unaffiliation: ideological polarization. A significant degree of alienation from religion among younger cohorts has to do with backlash towards the alignment of its institutions and public figures with the political right. During the evangelical boom beginning in the 1970s and extending throughout the 80s and 90s, an articulate form of Christian identity exerted considerable influence upon conservative politics and achieved broad visibility in the public sphere. Premised upon traditional values or family values, the Christian right represents a particular sensitivity to shifting gender roles, sexual permissiveness, changing attitudes towards homosexuality, and the federal legalization of abortion. It is not surprising to learn, therefore, that as younger Americans were still forming religious attachments during the 1990s, many of them translated that uneasiness into a rejection of religion entirely. Neither should we be surprised that, as one Pew Forum survey puts it, they became unaffiliated in part because they think of religious people as hypocritical, judgmental, or insincere, and that religious organizations focus too much on rules and not enough on spirituality. These are admonitions worth pondering, and I think it helpful to see the content and tone of Amoris Laetitia as directly attuned to the restlessness they harbor. This is not to say that Pope Francis is uncritical of secularity, of course. The Pope regularly criticizes an extreme individualism, as he puts it, which disparages institutions, weakens family bonds, turns freedom into caprice, and exhibits a fear of commitment. He also calls out the dangers of what we might call presentism, that dismissively judges past generations based upon current tastes and norms, noting that derision of traditions and family structures cuts us off from a much-needed historical memory, as he puts it, and a greater sense of affiliation with our ancestors, with the elderly, and with a wider circle of family that situates us within a vast nexus of human relations. And of instrumentalist attitudes, Pope Francis is particularly critical, noting that persons are not objects, that ours is too often the culture of the ephemeral that disposes of people when deemed no longer serviceable, that marriage is too often regarded as a contractual agreement, that sexuality is poisoned by the mentality of use and discard, as he puts it, his phrase, or that children should never be the solution to personal needs. In fact, Pope Francis's criticisms are so trenchant at times that one might suspect that he is essentially reactionary to the ideals and language of personal authenticity that comes so naturally to younger generations who self-describe as spiritual but not religious. But this is not so. Taking my cue from the work of philosopher Charles Taylor, I see the tone and argumentation of Amoris Laetitia as neither reactionary to the ideals of self-fulfillment in contemporary society, nor supportive of them in their current form. Pope Francis avoids blanket condemnations just as he avoids blanket affirmations. Instead, we find him affirming the moral force behind notions like self-fulfillment, while challenging and deepening them. For example, after strongly criticizing individualism, the Pope immediately continues by offering a richer account of human freedom. Quote, "We rightly value a personalism that opts for authenticity as opposed to mere conformity." He continues, "While this can favor spontaneity and a better use of people's talents, if misdirected, it can foster attitudes of constant suspicion, fear of commitment, self-centeredness, and arrogance. Freedom of choice makes it possible to plan our lives and to make the most of ourselves. Yet, if this freedom lacks noble goals or personal discipline, it degenerates into an inability to give oneself generously to others." It's paragraph 35. The elements of this quote, I submit, provide a key for discerning the basic argumentative structure of the entire encyclical. What it does, in short, is as follows. First, it affirms the ideals of personal authenticity that appeal to so many persons today. Second, it warns of its excesses. And third, it challenges and deepens it by connecting it to larger ideals, goals, and the work of self-discipline. The broadest way Amoris Laetitia does this is by appealing to the category of growth. This permeates the entire document, and it's come up in our conversation, growth. Never do we see an attempt to browbeat the reader into submitting to an institution. And to this extent, Pope Francis responds quite directly to contemporary suspicions of rules, codes, and rigid adherence to tradition. Instead, we find appeals to personalism, the cultivation of virtues, to the development of affectivity, to aspirations of wholeness. Life in the family, he argues, is a profounder, richer, more challenging way to realize human potential than what individualism has to offer. Not by making family the occasion for one's personal quest, but by undergoing a process of dedication, relationship, and growth through the joy and pain experienced with others. Genuine self-fulfillment is not condemned by the Pope as mere egoism, but affirmed as more truly possible in the context of committed relationships with others. The struggle here is not, therefore, over whether personal authenticity is a legitimate moral and spiritual source. Rather, it's a struggle over defining its true dimensions and proper significance. Speaking directly to younger cohorts, and here I think we can imagine him speaking specifically to the nuns, Pope Francis writes, "I would like to say to young people that none of our deepest aspirations are jeopardized when our love finds expression in marriage. Their union encounters in this institution the means to ensure that their love truly will endure and grow. As a social institution, marriage protects and shapes a shared commitment to one another for the good of society as a whole. That is why marriage is more than a fleeting fashion," he adds. "It is of enduring importance. Its essence derives from our human nature and social character." Paragraph 131. Notice here the direct appeal to young people, and notice also the category of growth operative in it. Our deepest aspirations are not negated by such an institution, but is in fact protected and made more meaningful by it. For marriage not only serves an educative process for two persons who aspire to human fullness together, but it contributes to the common good in all its interpersonal and social dimensions. It is not mere duty or convention, in other words, it is growth in genuine authenticity. This is how, to conclude, I see Amoris Laetitia assisting the church's engagement with the nuns. For those standing at the edges of religious institutions, the encyclical serves as a public summons to embrace the personal and social goods of love in the family. While obviously addressed to persons in the church, the encyclical's audience is much broader, and it includes those who are wary of traditional institutions, religious or otherwise. Such engagement cannot presuppose that those numbered among the nuns will pick up and read a papal encyclical as part of their own journey. But this is not how we should assess the potential effectiveness of Amoris Laetitia's appeal. Rather, we should see in it the outline of an invitation as well as an argument that can assist those in the church who are called to witness to the lived wisdom of love in the family. The church has a distinctive role to play in communicating and embodying that lived wisdom for the good of society, including when the religious character of that society is in a state of flux or even decline. And to the extent that a Christian way of life will attract those who are on the margins of religious belonging today, it will have no small part to do with the way Christians embody love in the family as a path to growth. Thank you.
So the next is Natalia and Heraclian.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Jim and to Tony, and most especially to all the bishops gathered here. As I said last night at dinner, it's no exaggeration to say that this is the sort of event I had in mind when I pursued degrees in theology. The ability to be in dialogue with and in service to you. So let me begin. Oh, I especially thank you for hanging with me after lunch, which I know is quite difficult. Latino Catholics in their lives and through their theologies stand at the leading edge of a church of encounter and accompaniment, ushering us away from a church of command and obligation. My view of the reception of Amoris Laetitia and the Hispanic contribution to that reception necessarily takes two kinds of perspectives. The first is hemispheric, not only because of the technological advances that have shrunk our hemisphere or because of the demographic reality of a predominantly Hispanic church here in this country, but because popes since John Paul II have encouraged U.S. Catholics to embrace a self-understanding that there is but one ecclesia in America. Thus, any discussion of ecclesial reception in America should draw on a hemispheric range of sources. Insights not only from Hispanic theologians in the U.S., but from theologians in Mexico and Peru, from Pope Francis's comments in Colombia, the guidelines of the Argentinian bishops, all of these are part of the reception of Amoris Laetitia. In addition to the macrocosm of the hemispheric church, though, my understanding of the reception of Amoris Laetitia is informed by the microcosm of my own social location as a married mother of two sons, a laywoman theologian, and a Cuban American. I must confess, the majority of my sense of the impact of Amoris Laetitia comes from my experience of co-raising two children, particularly of the futility and folly of supposing that a family is anything like a closed system where expectations are presented by parents and flawlessly executed by children. Family life has been, for me, an experience marked by continual metanoia, a constant catechesis, inviting me to rethink what I presumed were inflexible principles like maternal instinct or family expectations, and applying them to the living, evolving relationships in which I am entwined on a daily basis. It is my hope that Pope Francis is inviting the whole church into that dynamic that I learn in my own corner of the domestic church. So within the framework of Francis calling the church to a new catechesis on the family, what do the experiences of Latino and Latina Catholics have to offer the reception of this post-synodal exhortation? Three key concepts we must understand in order to grasp the reception of Amoris Laetitia in Latinx communities are colonialism, conscience, and accompaniment. The reception of Amoris cannot be understood apart from the historical context of colonialism in Latin America and in Latinx communities in the United States. The legacy of colonialism is one marked by violence, physical, cultural, and spiritual violence. This legacy means that in the Hispanic community, certain dangerous tendencies are intensified in the interaction of families and lay people generally with the church. Ecclesially, this is manifest in two complementary realities: the infantilization of the laity and clericalism. Reading Amoris from the perspective of the Hispanic Church, we see Pope Francis pointing to the infantilization of the laity and families that is so commonly a feature of colonization in paragraph 37, for example, and I'm quoting. "We have long thought that simply by stressing doctrinal, bioethical, and moral issues without encouraging openness to grace, we were providing sufficient support to families, strengthening the marriage bond, and giving meaning to marital life." He continues, "We find it difficult to present marriage more as a dynamic path to personal development and fulfillment than as a lifelong burden. We also find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best as they can to the gospel amid their limitations and are capable of carrying out their own discernment." And that's when he says, "We've been called to form consciences and not replace them," end quote. The desire to replace the conscience of the laity, or the failure to make room for those, points to a vision of these laity as dependent children, incapable of higher order moral thought. Infantilizing the laity in this way has its historical roots in a view of lay people as objects of clerical control, there to pay, pray, and obey, or as Pius X notes in Vehemente Nos, "The one duty of the multitude is to allow themselves to be led, and like a docile flock to follow the pastors," end quote. If this was true of the laity broadly understood, it was intensified in the case of colonized territories like Latin America. Historically, non-European cultures were viewed as indolent and incapable of learning, particularly indigenous and Black communities. This accounts for the dearth of indigenous clergy all over Latin America for so long. The repercussions of the dominant culture's reluctance to ordain indigenous clergy can still be seen in the relatively small number of Hispanic bishops in a church that is increasingly Spanish-speaking here in the U.S. 42 to 45% of U.S. Catholics identify as Latino and Latina, and 3% of priests do. As my colleague Josman Ospino has noted, 60% of Catholics in the U.S. under the age of 18 are Hispanic. How are we dealing not with some amorphous future, but with the Church's present population? Are we meeting their challenges and incorporating their wisdom? Within the colonial frame that shapes our approach to Latinx and Latin American Catholics, married life can still be viewed vestigially as a haven for lust, particularly for populations of color where hypersexuality is assumed as a cultural feature. Conjugal life is therefore overdetermined, an object of moral pronouncements and abstract ideals about the function of marriage as unitive, procreative, or indissoluble. Failure to live up to these ideals reinforces the caricatures of indolence, violence, and again, of hypersexuality. In the face of this, we see many marriages in Latino communities that are irregular. Couples circumventing the church because of lack of access to clergy or lack of resources to pay for a church wedding, or circumstances of migration that preclude the reality of marriage. Lay people are further infantilized by a logic, as pointed out by the Argentine bishop's guidelines on Amoris, where pastors serve as gatekeepers, offering permission for sacraments, rather than as counselors who accompany Catholics on their sacramental journeys. The gatekeeper paradigm is not limited to Latino and Latina churches, as I learned firsthand at my son's confirmation preparation meeting last year, where the pastor of the parochial school declared that he, and he alone, decides who gets confirmed in our neighborhood. It all had a very Dirty Harry feel. In Amoris, Francis espouses the imagery of accompaniment rather than gatekeeping, promoting the laity's ability to discern appropriate courses of action. One could easily come to the facile conclusion that this infantilization of lay people is a great sin committed only by the clergy. But the phenomenon is not one-sided. Clericalism is the complement to the infantilizing impulse of the colonial view, and it is not a problem unique to the clergy. Pope Francis's repeated admonitions against clericalism serve as a warning for the laity as much as for priests, maybe even more pointedly for lay people. Non-clergy are tempted to clericalism, to elevate the priest to superhuman status, and thereby to infantilize themselves, to become children who are told what to do, which can be easier than doing the hard work of developing one's conscience and engaging in discernment. Infantilization and clericalism cannot be separated, nor are they sins that belong to only one sector or another of the church. As Pope Francis frequently says, we are all sinners here. Against the logic of colonialism, clericalism, and infantilization, we must assert the message of liberation theologians that the poor and the marginalized are subjects of their own history. Analogously, then, the family after Amoris becomes the protagonist of its own destiny. In paragraph 200, we read that the Synod Fathers declared that Christian families are, quote, the principal agents of the family apostolate, end quote. Couples become the subjects of their history, even as pastors and confessors retain a role of accompaniment and listening in order to orient this intrafamilial ministry. A second category within which to understand the reception of Amoris in Latinx cultures is conscience. When the document claims in paragraph 37 that we're called to form and not replace consciences, Peruvian theologian Gregorio Pérez de Guereñol comments that the replacement of conscience is, quote, an act of domination. Again, colonization. It is an abuse of power. The formation of conscience, on the other hand, is a life-giving ministry because it loves an other into freedom. Here, it might be beneficial to explore the notion of freedom within the church. Many of the misgivings and nervousness about Amoris expressed by some sectors of the church seem to surround the move away from doctrine as something one asserts, expecting obedience, toward doctrine as something derived from unchanging principles, but that nevertheless requires application to specific circumstances, not all of which are identical. The concern frequently is expressed in a worry that this will, quote, confuse the faithful, which, yet again, reflects an infantilizing impulse. This move is itself, I fear, a childish view of the freedom necessary for discernment and conscience. Let me give you a real-world example. My children lament, almost all of the time, that they are not adults, because in their view, adults get to, quote, do whatever they want. My standard response, in varying tones depending on the amount of patience I have remaining in that day, usually very little, is I never, ever get to do what I want. I do other people's laundry, I make other people's food, I shuttle other people around, but it's very rarely do I do what I want. In moving away from rigid magisterial presentations, some fear that relativism is going to creep in, that the laity will just do whatever it wants. This is a child's view of freedom. Adult life, as we all know, particularly adult life enmeshed in relationships of care, seldom results in doing whatever I want. My desires are always already desires in relation. My decisions affect my spouse and my children and my mother and my colleagues and my students. Latinx theology invites us to think of human freedom differently because it presents an alternate view of the human person. Gary Ribia-Estrella noted that Latino communities, rather than being a voluntary association of individuals focused on self-determination, tend to view themselves anthropologically as socially constituted. This pre-existent we that characterizes me factors into the reception of Amoris in Latino communities. Ribi's description highlights a different approach to the human person shared by many outside the Latino community and serves as an invitation to those who don't. Latinx Catholics have long embraced Jim Keenan's suggestion that Amoris proposes relationality in the face of cold rationality. Roberto Goizueta's work builds on this anthropological notion of we. He describes humanity in relation as necessary or pre-existent. Entering into relationship is not merely an option between two autonomous individuals. There's a sense in which we belong to other people. This is what makes us human. We're responsible to others. Freedom, then, is not freedom from interference, but rather freedom in relation. This freedom is where conscience operates, and it functions in relation, not as an individual act of an isolated will. The final category I wish to highlight in Latinx theology that helps contextualize the reception of Amoris Laetitia is accompaniment. No other word speaks to the goal of Pope Francis's papacy and the point of Amoris like accompaniment. It is the praxis that lives alongside conscience between ideal principles and their application to particular situations, and it is the special vocation of Christians to accompany one another. Accompaniment is a notion at the heart of Latino communities. In language and expressions of grief, right? I accompany you in your pain. In our greetings and goodbyes, right? Que Dios te acompañe, may God accompany you. Deeply rooted in these cultures, it's not surprising that accompaniment features as well in Latino theology. In Goizueta's Caminemos con Jesús, as just one example. A model of ministry and really an entire ecclesiology based on accompaniment is what I believe Francis is aiming for in Amoris Laetitia. This marks, crucially, a move away from what Cardinal Schonborn has called a, quote, ethics of obligation that generates both laxity and rigorism, end quote. The ethics of obligation is, I believe, an ecclesiological hallmark of North American Catholicism, influenced by Northern European cultures. Latinx theologians like Goizueta suggest accompaniment as an alternative model, rooted in the popular Catholic practices of a variety of Latino cultures. The act of traveling with an other is seen in devotions like Christmas Posadas or Marian devotion to the Virgen Dolorosa or to Our Lady of la Soledad. For Goizueta, accompaniment guards against romanticization because we can only romanticize that which we do not truly know. What does this accompaniment look like in Amoris Laetitia? The walking with families and couples traversing diverse realities and true challenges serves as a catechesis for all the companions on the journey. Just as popular Catholic practices in Hispanic communities foreground the sacred in the everyday, accompaniment in ministry may reveal the possibility that the daily life of couples and families has something to offer to doctrinal pronouncements on marriage. If nothing else, accompaniment works against the romanticization of marriage and family that pervades our church's teachings on these topics, and even creeps into Amoris in its discussion of mothering and fathering in Chapter 5. Accompaniment implies equality, a walk alongside. It demands empathy and understanding from all parties, but it also implies ethics and politics. In what direction are we walking? What are we walking to or for? This is for Goizueta a central concern, and the point for understanding Francis's exhortation is that it must not be the theologian or the pastor alone who sets the direction. The magnetic north of accompaniment is the encounter with Christ. The fact that ethics is involved in this accompaniment does not automatically assign the role of directing or navigating to the pastor. Rather, everyone on the journey is capable and called to navigate, and there will be times, as there have been, when couples lead the way to the encounter with Christ. It is possible, then, for pastors accompanying families to learn that couples themselves are capable of pointing toward this encounter with God and invite the whole church to learn from this. If we learn nothing else from Hispanic theology, we should know that the sacredness of the everyday is paramount. The scandal of the incarnation is that this right here, this messiness, this ugliness is where grace is found. Accompaniment allows us to affirm everyday particularity and embodiment in its beauty and its ugliness, and this is the model of family ministry to which the post-synodal exhortation invites us. In truth, there's no way to speak for the millions of Hispanic Catholics in the U.S. or their reception of Amoris Laetitia. As a systematic theologian, I can point to specific problems that certainly must have resonated within these communities: the pervasive reality of domestic violence, the horror of drug addiction and alcohol abuse in families, the impact of unjust migration laws and abject poverty on couples. I can also highlight ways in which the message of Amoris is intensified by the colonial history of Latin America and the U.S., the violence of clericalism and infantilization in which we all participate. But what I would much rather be the takeaway, instead of the ways in which the Latino community is reacting to the document, are the varied ways in which Latinos and Latinas, in their daily lives and practice, and in their theological and anthropological insights, invite all Christians to embody the message of Amoris in the Church Universal. The centrality of conscience and freedom in relation, the notion of relationality as a pre-existent condition of humanity and not an act of the will, and the vision of accompaniment as a model for ministry in all aspects of the Church are what I hope will be the contributions of the reception of Amoris in this country and in the whole Church. Thank you so much.
Let's welcome Vanessa White from the Catholic Theological
In Chicago.
In Chicago. It's always, we always have that confusion. I would like to begin by saying thank you for the invitation to be here this afternoon. I hope to share with you some reflection on the Black Catholic experience, and to think of this as part of an African American quilt and different aspects of the quilt that I will highlight as we journey together. Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, acknowledges the challenges facing families today, as well as addressing the pastoral implications for ministers who journey with families. Many of the challenges and concerns he addressed, as well as the pastoral implications, intersect with the challenges faced by Black Catholic families here in the United States. I am grateful for the opportunity to share with you this reflection on how Amoris Laetitia has been received within the Black Catholic community. As a practical womanist theologian, and you can afterward ask me, what does womanist mean? We can go into a whole dialogue on that, whose focus is spirituality, and one who has used Amoris Laetitia in my classroom. I wish to begin by framing my remarks with the words and experiences of a diverse community of Black Catholic scholars and theologians. I acknowledge the contributions of first-generation Black Catholic theologians, Sean Copeland, Diana Hayes, and Jamie Phelps, as well as the work of Black Catholic historian Father Cyprian Davis, whose book, History of Black Catholics in the United States, has given voice to Black Catholics whose contributions in history had remained invisible within the institutional church. Furthermore, moral theologian and activist Father Brian Massengale's groundbreaking book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, is a must-reading for anyone ministering here in the United States in the Black community. The writings of Copeland, Hayes, Phelps, Davis, and Massengale are an invaluable resource for gaining a greater understanding of the context of Black Catholic life, faith, and spirituality. The late Father Cyprian Davis has stated that the story of African American Catholicism is the story of a people who obstinately clung to a faith that gave them sustenance, even when it did not always make them feel welcome. I share with you a reflection from a Black Catholic graduate alum at Catholic Theological Union. Her reflection, entitled Like a Motherless Child, addresses the reality of Black Catholics who many times had to push their way in, who felt like motherless children. Mother Church, I am here. Mother Church, I am ready. Mother Church, I am willing. Mother Church, I have been knocking for years. You have locked me out for years. I will not go away. I will not disappear. You have to open your doors. I will not stop knocking. Mother Church, I will knock till there is a hole in your door. I will come through that hole. I will bring my open heart and my open mind. I will bring my mother, my God. Yes, Mother Church, I am here. I am knocking. I am willing. I am ready. I will no longer feel like a motherless child. Black Catholics have had to fight for their faith, and this fight was not only with other Catholics who questioned their legitimacy as Catholics, but also often with members of their own household who could not understand why they embraced a faith that did not always recognize their gifts. Black Catholic families have challenged one another and challenged the church to be truly Christian and Catholic. Sister Thea Bowman, Franciscan Sister of Perpetual Adoration, stated that within African American households can be found large families, small families, nuclear families, extended families, single parent families, adopted and foster families, rich families, poor families, matriarchal and patriarchal families, gospel-loving, shouting, testifying, fussing, and fighting families. There is not one typical description that can be ascribed to African American families. In 2011, sociologists Darren Davis and Don Pope Davis hoped to shed a light on the faith of African Americans in the very first National Black Catholic Survey sponsored by the National Black Catholic Congress and the Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. This survey sought to measure the religious engagement of African Americans. Davis and Pope Davis concluded from their study that African American Catholics tended to be highly engaged, particularly if members of a predominantly Black parish. Membership in a Black parish reflects shared social and cultural experiences that connect people through a common identity. The importance of social connections of African American Catholics and the influence on religious engagement cannot be overstated. In many ways, it's within these Black parishes that they do not feel invisible. The invisibility of Black Catholics has been a pain and has been something that we as a church must look at. Because the numbers are small does not mean that we should not be valued and that we do not have something to say and contribute to the broader church. This would tend to reinforce what our Black bishops initially stated in 1984 in their pastoral letter on evangelization in the Black community entitled, "What We Have Seen and Heard." And one of the authors is with us, Bishop Wilton Gregory. In this letter, the bishops recognize 4 characteristics of Black spirituality and religiosity. Black spirituality is contemplative, holistic, communitarian, and joyful. Furthermore, for Black Catholics, God was felt deep down in their souls. And as Sister Thea Bowman has stated, their spirituality is the soul of the people. To minister to African American Catholic families, one must understand the roots of their spirituality and how their spirituality has shaped their family life and culture. That is what has been the focus of African American Catholic marriage and family life ministers Andrew and Terry Like. For the past 35 years, the Likes have focused on marriage and family within the Black community with their Arusi Network ministries and address the importance of attending to the spirituality and culture of African Americans in responding to the needs of families. In their new book, Marriage on a Lampstand, exploring a new paradigm for modern Christian marriage, they have sadly concluded that the institution of marriage has virtually collapsed among African Americans. As the Likes have shared, we marry least compared to all measured ethnic groups, and when we marry, we divorce at the highest rate. What has been the Catholic Church's response? According to the Likes, predominantly African American parishes are the least likely to have a viable outreach to marriage. So what's happening in our community and within our families? What's not happening? Our families are faced with racism, incarceration, underemployment, unemployment, inadequate housing, domestic abuse, poor health care, violence, systematic exclusion from full participation in political, social, educational, economic, and religious organizations and institutions. It is a virtual litany of challenges. In light of these challenges, what new approaches to catechizing, encouraging, supporting, and celebrating marriage and family have been implemented? Also, Terry and Andrew Like challenged, are we reaching out to those who are ambivalent about marriage, yet are forming families? Andrew Like states that Amoris Laetitia invites and empowers an expansive approach to the church's accompaniment of families regarding the sacrament of marriage. In their book, they focus on the document's approach to accompaniment of families. For the Likes, a major theme of Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love, is accompaniment. Walking with families, journeying with families. They state there is a symbiotic relationship between marriage and community and the ministry of accompaniment that leads couples, regardless of their marital status, to participate in the sacramental life of the church through the public witness of marriage. While Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation seeks to address the reality and challenges of family life, as well as affirms the strengths of families, that struggle with a variety of challenges. Today, unfortunately, the document has not had a noticeable impact in the life of the Black Catholic community. When I was asked to give the presentation, I informally solicited feedback from colleagues in the Black Catholic community, members of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, Black Catholic graduate students at Catholic Theological Union, and ministers in the Black Catholic community in the Archdiocese of Chicago and beyond. And I asked them the question, how has Pope Francis's apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, been received in the Black community? One response was striking and came from a Black Catholic DRE who ministers to families in the parish in an urban city. She stated, I quote, "In response to your question regarding how has Amoris Laetitia been received, I offer the following observations. When Amoris Laetitia first came out, it was discussed briefly, and we included information in flyers, but there wasn't an overall interest from the congregation to read the document in its entirety. Some of our families are in survival mode, struggling with underemployment, divorce, and single parenthood. Families are simply trying to ensure that their children are not victims of the violence that plagues our city. We have families that come to church occasionally because of the struggles they are facing. If it is a question of work, school, or church, some of our families choose the former rather than the latter." She further responds, "When the Pope's words are encouraging and provide guidelines for ministers to serve God's people, our families are looking for more tangible solutions that plague them. I would say that rather than just talking about the joy of love as a document, we who have read it are attempting to use it as a guide to provide the support that our families need. This is the form of journeying with parents and children when they are faced with struggles, providing them with resources that can help them and letting them know that the church and Eucharist is always there to nourish their bodies and souls without restrictions. I guess letting our families know that they are not alone in the struggle and that God has not forsaken them. That is the best way we can implement the joy of love." The document must be in dialogue with the life and context of the people. Church leadership must learn and continue to make strides to understand the context of Black people and Black Catholic life. I am reminded of the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. Jesus knew her context. He responded and affirmed her gifts. He took the time to be present to her, and she was transformed. We must address the current realities of the Black community, which has been challenged historically and in the present day by racism, which has institutionally taken forms of increased unemployment and underemployment, inadequate health, incarceration, increased violence in our communities, and their impact on families. As Jesus knew the context of those he ministered to, we must do the same if we wish to have a spiritual and pastoral impact in the Black community. Our families are suffering because we have not addressed their pain, their reality, their struggles. I encourage our parishes and institutions that minister in the Black community to use Amoris Laetitia as well as resources developed at Black Catholic institutions, such as Xavier University's Institute for Black Catholic Studies, as a guide in developing programs that respond pastorally to the needs of Black Catholics in their communities. Members of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, of which I am a member, and which is an interdisciplinary association of Black Catholic scholars, are also available as a resource in responding to the pastoral needs of Black Catholic families. I share with you this afternoon a bibliography and a resource. Please take that back to your diocese. And please get some of those books and resources and read them. I know I have lots of books on my shelf. What's in my shelf? But do I actually open them really and engage in them? the resources that I give to you will really help in journeying pastorally and spiritually with our communities. May we continue in the days ahead to journey with families from our diverse communities and to truly live out the hopes and goals of Amoris Laetitia. Thank you.
So Brian, Kate. Next we have Kate Ward from North Carolina.
Good afternoon. I'm grateful that you're here and so grateful that I'm here with you. Amoris Laetitia stands within the tradition of the Church's moral reflection on the human person who is both constrained and free. While it's clear that our own willed choices do shape us, to quote Pope Benedict XVI, our freedom is profoundly shaped by our being and by its limits. Not only are other persons outside our control, but each one of us is outside his or her own control. Pope Francis strongly confirms this in Amoris Laetitia, writing, "Situated freedom, real freedom, is limited and conditioned. The degree of responsibility is not equal in all cases, and factors may exist which limit the ability to make a decision. Amoris Laetitia acknowledges several specific ways that economic factors shape, constrain, and limit our moral freedom. I will present some ways that concrete economic realities in the US can constrain the freedom of people and families, and discuss how, in the face of these realities, the Church can work to empower people in freedom and to be good news. In the US, economic security, or lack of it, increasingly defines life choices as fundamental as whether someone will marry at all. A growing marriage gap describes the reality that those with college degrees are significantly more likely to marry and less likely to divorce than those with less education. It's been alleged that poor people marry less because they value marriage less. Perhaps they have a different culture than those better off. But sociologists disagree. In fact, poor women value marriage a great deal. Unfortunately, they struggle to find partners who meet their completely reasonable standards. They think both marriage partners should be responsible, mature, and financially stable. While shaky economic prospects hinder marriage, they can encourage the pursuit of successive short-term partnerships out of financial necessity. Economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton observe that repeated repartnering in the US is often driven by the need for an additional income, something that is less true in Europe with its more extensive safety net. And contrary to claims that marriage is a simple solution for poverty, 1 in 4 US families consisting of married parents with children qualifies as low income, living on less than $38,000 per year for a family of 4. In the openness to concrete reality that is so characteristic of Amoris Laetitia, Francis insists over and over that single-parent families must be welcome in parishes, and sensitively discusses the many complex reasons for their formation. I hope by now it's clear that welcome to single-parent families is welcome to the poor. This is a crucial pastoral way for the Church to be good news. Since economic instability prevents people who desire marriage from feeling able to attain it, the Church's social mission provides more opportunity to bring good news to this reality. We already know that we are called to build an economy that meets the needs of all. What policies will best help support marriage and families? Not simply increasing access to work. Unfortunately, it's very possible in the US to work full-time and still be poor enough to qualify for means-tested benefits or to fail to afford housing. We need a much stronger social safety net to help people form families. Universal health care would be a good start. I would also recommend that the US bishops study and consider supporting universal basic income. This is a very exciting, practical proposal for putting an economic floor under the most vulnerable while reducing stigma. Consistent with many concerns of Catholic social thought, it helps meet human needs, promotes dignified work, and operates through subsidiarity. More primordially, the Church must loudly proclaim the truth that accepting help, whether from government benefits or private charity, is nothing to be ashamed of. Catholics know that we are created by God as social beings who depend on one another, and that this is not a flaw, but God's desire for us. And as you know, this is why the Catholic social tradition consistently approves of government programs, such as the family benefits found in Europe, to help families meet their basic needs. Certainly, the U.S. Church advocates strongly for the social welfare programs that already exist here, but I think there is room to more sharply criticize the ways that the U.S. cultural value of self-reliance can become weaponized against our society's most vulnerable. As Dorothy Day said, the poor realize pretty well that they are but dust, and one of our jobs is to help them realize that they are also a little less than the angels. A strong social safety net that provides for human needs without shame or stigma will empower marriages and strengthen families. Another aspect of family life that economic realities affect profoundly is parents' readiness to welcome children. This is especially fraught in the US, where economic structures make it functionally impossible to pursue a career and remain open to life at the same time. Consider parents who wish to take leave from work after the birth of a baby. Only 13% of workers have access to paid leave, and many fear career consequences if they actually use it. FMLA guarantees unpaid leave, which does precious little good when families depend on that parent's paycheck. This helps explain why nearly a quarter of new mothers in the US return to work within 2 weeks after giving birth. It is hard to argue that US society truly values children when we expect parents to give up crucial income to be there at the most vulnerable time in their children's lives. While US society may not welcome children, individual Americans do. Most would like to have more children than they eventually will. Economic factors also play a role in the timing of family formation. Women without college degrees are more likely than not to have children outside marriage, whereas women with degrees rarely do. And sociologists explain that poor women are well aware their economic prospects are constrained. They know intuitively what economists confirm, that US inequality is sticky at both the bottom and the top. So if you're born poor, you're likely to stay that way. And when professional careers seem out of reach, children offer a tangible source of meaning, leading to early parenthood for many poor women. Wealthier parents often delay children for many years as they complete their education and establish careers. This engenders different anxieties, including pressure to marry quickly and concerns with later in life fertility. And just speaking from the experiences of my own friends and family, I can say that it's very possible to have the good fortune of being well-educated and married and still find that achieving openness to life demands excruciating attention to timing. Threading the needle of professional and educational commitments, the limitations and timeframes of employer health care coverage, and stark calculations of the impact of time off on the family budget can make a joyous event feel like a ticking time bomb. This is such a common story in the US that perhaps we forget it's caused by structural factors and not inherent to the nature of parenthood. Of course, the structural conflict between career and openness to life weighs much more heavily on poor parents. College-educated parents are often praised for delaying parenthood, and they reap financial and professional rewards. The genuine stress of balancing professional careers with children's needs do not compare with the burdens of parents in poverty. Struggling to raise children on limited resources, they can expect not praise, but often derision for their openness to life. Our culture proclaims, through economic structure and, regrettably, in explicit public discourse, that children are only gifts and blessings if their parents are well off. To our shame as a society, stigmas persist of poor parents having children carelessly, even instrumentally. In 16 states, this stigma is written into law in the practice of welfare family caps. Amoris Laetitia makes it perfectly clear that welcoming children is the responsibility of a whole society. Francis writes, "There are those who dare to say that it was a mistake to bring these children into the world. This is shameful. How can we issue solemn declarations on human rights and the rights of children if we then punish children for the errors of adults?" A society that claims to value children should put its money where its mouth is, and never be content for children born to impoverished parents to suffer worse outcomes than children from wealthy families. Francis invites Christians to denounce cultural factors, such as the idolization of market logic, that prevent authentic family life and lead to discrimination, poverty, exclusion, and violence. The church can be good news by advocating for policies such as paid family leave for both mothers and fathers. More profoundly, the church must prophetically call society to value each child, including those born in poverty. The US has a misguided cultural notion that having children is a private decision, akin to buying a motorcycle, where all the costs and burdens should be borne by the parents, whose, after all, choice it was. Children are not consumer goods, and welcoming them is a central experience of human life that societies should support. They are gifts not just to their parents, but to the whole society, which in turn shares the responsibility of helping them flourish. I'll conclude with a suggestion for pastoral teaching. For a long time, both US culture and Catholic social thought assigned men the role of breadwinner, worker, and family provider. Women, long assigned the role of caregiver, in recent decades have been integrated into the workplace, and of course, in reality, many were already there, without, however, putting down their caregiving burden at home. Today, Catholics need an integrated vision of human life that helps men and women properly order both work and care in light of inviolable human dignity. For men and women, both work and care are important practices in a fully human life, but human dignity and self-worth must not depend on either one. Americans pride ourselves on our strong work ethic, which seems to fit well with a valued place of work in Catholic social thought, although it must be said that work in Catholic social thought describes much more than what we do for wages. But there are serious downsides to equating self-worth with wage-earning labor, as US culture encourages us to do. What happens to the worker when the work goes away? Economists have blamed shrinking work opportunities for an increase in deaths of despair, drug and alcohol deaths, and suicides. Layoffs are increasingly treated as a normal way of doing business, despite their human cost of poor health, low self-esteem, suicidal thoughts, and broken relationships. The impact of unemployment or diminished economic opportunity on mental health and spiritual well-being is especially concerning in light of the millions of jobs that could be lost to automation over the coming decades. For example, the adoption of driverless vehicles will soon threaten 3.5 million trucking jobs, the most common job in 29 US states. Automation is not a bad thing when it reduces the need for humans to do dangerous, boring, or otherwise alienating work. True, the rise of automation could increase human suffering and lead to social unrest if jobs are lost and not replaced. Or, as some observers advise, we could respond proactively, embracing shorter work weeks, offering a robust social safety net, and accepting that workers have more free time for more human pursuits, other human pursuits. This structural change will only succeed if we can manage to convey the good news that human worth is innate, not tied to wages. And as I said earlier, if we can remind society of the truth that humans are innately interdependent and accepting help is no source of shame. The overvaluing of wage labor in our society harms all workers, and harms men in particular when they cannot perform the role of breadwinner. Women, for their part, struggle with the undervaluing of care. As theologian Christine Firahinzi details, unpaid caregiving work in the home imposes a significant burden on women, who more and more frequently work outside the home as well. While wage work is valuable and rewarding, care work literally keeps the human family afloat. Yet the significant value it contributes to society, as well as the cost borne by the caregiver, is rarely appreciated. The solution is to properly value care, to see it as a crucial, life-giving, and necessary practice that all adult members of the household must share in. Caring for one another is a fundamental human activity, just as work is. So, far from dividing up a distasteful burden, we should see this as an invitation to men who do not engage in care to become more fully human. To enable a vision of human life where both work and care are valued and given their proper order for both women and men, the Church needs a new theology of masculinity. To his great credit, Pope Francis points the way in Amoris Laetitia when he writes, "Masculinity and femininity are not rigid categories. It is possible, for example, that a husband's way of being masculine can be flexibly adapted to the wife's work schedule. Taking on domestic chores or some aspects of raising children does not make him any less masculine or feminine, or imply failure, irresponsibility, or cause for shame." And I was so happy to hear about the role of tenderness in men's lives. I think that this new theology of masculinity is in the process of being born. This is a significant development in the Catholic social tradition, which for too long described a father's role in the family primarily in terms of a breadwinner. And it's a signal example of Amoris Laetitia's attention to concrete realities. In the US, many women and men already live as both creative beings engaged in work and loving beings engaged in care. The Church can help by giving voice to this anthropology. The human person is creative, striving, caring, and social. We depend on one another, and that dependence is not a flaw, but part of our nature. US culture tries to deny some of these truths by demeaning dependence, undervaluing care, withholding social support, privatizing parenthood, and structuring work to exclude family life. But these social tendencies are not set in stone. We can work to change them. Poor and middle-class US people find love, welcome life, support children, and build lifelong commitments, despite economic structures that make these beautiful and basic human actions much harder than they need to be. Every day, they write stories of struggle and hope. The better we understand how economic realities can constrain the freedom of human families, the more clearly we can see that God's grace is indeed at work in their concrete situations. This is Amoris Laetitia's good news. Thank you.